Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 5, What I Suck At. I'm Chris Muntz and I'm the host of this show, and I'm excited about this episode. It's going to be a little bit of a potpourri, if you'll pardon the expression. We're going to talk about several things in this podcast, including responding to some Choralosopher feedback to earlier episodes. If you don't know, Choralosophers is a Facebook group where we can discuss a variety of show-related topics, plus any choral topics that you're interested in picking the minds of the members of the group. So we're going to be shouting out some of our group members and some of their comments and contributions to this topic. Also going to be doing an ACDA conference reflection, as well as a promotion of what I see as a healthy openness about our flaws. As choral directors, by being open about our flaws, we can actually lead to a better job performance, and our ability to work as part of a team, our ability to lead people can actually increase by opening ourselves to the things that we suck at. So all of those topics are going to be covered in today's episode. My efforts here at Choralosophy Podcast are also supported by RyanMain.com. Ryan is a self-published composer whose music is a godsend for teachers. If you have not yet found Ryan, head over to RyanMain.com. Every time I teach one of his pieces, I find that the kids buy in right away, but they aren't bored a month later. You've heard me say this on past episodes before, and I'm going to give you a more live update. We're working on his Daniel right now, Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? And we've had 11 snow days, as many of us in the Midwest have been feeling. We started learning it in January, but we've lost 2 weeks. Well, now they've got it to the point where it's memorized. There's just enough repeated material where they're getting it pretty quickly, but there's still so much left to do that's keeping them engaged the 2 weeks out before our festival. So all of his music that I've seen is that way, and there's so many layers of the onion to dig in with Ryan's music. So head over to RyanMain.com, use the Choralosophy code at checkout for 10% off on each licensed PDF that you select. We are also supported by the best music literacy product on the market, SightReadingFactory.com. Their site has recently been revamped and has added a ton of new features. So if you have not signed up for accounts for you and your students, this is a great time to do it. They've done kind of a beta version of a bunch of new features. You can crank your ensembles up to level 7 or 8 now, instead of just 6 at the top end. You can extend exercises up to 24 measures. And they also have a new challenge mode setting, which you'll just have to go check out for yourself. You can also enter Choralosophy at checkout there to get 10% off and get your kids sight reading on a level that you've never dreamed possible. So today's my first chance in a while to sit down and do some work on the podcast. I've been missing you guys. It's my first chance after a really busy ACDA convention week with 2 performances there that I had lots of details to coordinate for. And I kind of, am of course, humbled and excited that we got to perform at that convention on a couple different programs. However, also kind of jealous of all the folks that just got to go and watch. It was extremely stressful. Didn't feel like I was able to come up for air very much. And there were a lot of folks that were interested in connecting and having conversations during the course of the week that I just wasn't able to get to. So we'll hopefully be able to continue our conversations through this medium and through the show. Then when I got back from ACDA, it was solo and ensemble at school, our festival week. So all of our soloists and small groups at the high school had their competition on Friday and Saturday. So it's just been crazy the last little bit. So I'm excited to get back to normal life and also regular recording. So I'm looking at spring break coming up next week like a starved dog, just feeling like I cannot keep my eyes off of that time off with my family, with my friends, and a chance to just catch up and breathe. So the first little segment of this episode, again, we're going to chat a little bit about the convention. I want to do a little reflection of the convention, and there were obviously so many things that were highlights. Of course, if you're have any amount of choral pulse and follow things on social media, That came out wrong. I shouldn't say that you have to follow things on social media in order to have a choral pulse. I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse of the choral world through social media. How's that? I don't want to offend any of you who are social media antis, which, depending on the day, I could be anti or pro social media. But there were so many highlights of the convention, and lots of people on social media, of course, have shared the big ones. Of course, the Aeolians performance was just ridiculous. And I unfortunately did not get to see their Helzberg Hall performance, which would have been the one on my track. But I did get to see them at the music and worship session. To make it even worse, the reason I didn't get to see the Aeolians at Helzberg Hall was because of a waiter who took 35 minutes to get us the check during lunch. The performance was 2 something, and we were eating kind of a late lunch and just begging to leave so that I could get to that concert on time. And just to rub salt in the wound, I arrived in the lobby of the Kauffman Center just in time to hear the screams from inside, but too late to hear the performance. So I was super, super frustrated. Was all set. One of my biggest priorities for the whole convention was to see that performance. So I did get to go later and see them at the music and worship at the cathedral, which was also an amazing experience to hear them in that acoustic, which was very cool. So that's one of the big highlights for a lot of people. We saw a lot of discussion about that, and I think that's valid. They definitely stole the show from everything I've seen afterwards, even of recordings from the Helzberg Hall concert, and just super proud of that group for a lot of reasons. To be able to go in and sing that many different styles in front of that many experts, I guess you could say, in all of the styles, that they sang. That's probably a safe assumption that in an audience at the National Convention of ACDA, you're going to open yourself up to, if you sing a program that's that diverse, there's probably an expert in each type of music that you perform in the room. That's a lot of pressure, and maybe the college-age students didn't think of it that way, but as a conductor, I sure would have. So that was a really cool thing, and I'm glad that they were able to make as big of an impact as they did. Tons of great performances, too. I was really proud of my former students. I had a bunch of former students there performing with their college choirs, which was really fun to see them and support them. But one of the things that I want to dive into in more detail would be one of the highlights of the convention for me that I didn't see much conversation about on social media, partly because it was from a session that not a lot of people went to. It was relatively sparsely attended, but ended up being one of my favorite things for the whole convention. And that was one of my former teachers, Eve Ely's session called What's Important. And I just maybe a little bit biased because I love that man, but partly thought it was a highlight for me because of the unique way that he has of pointing out to people how to find their why, which might end up being an entire episode in the future. Of course, when he started his little talk, the host of the Choralosophy podcast was sitting in the audience and got really excited that when he said, what's really important, the very first thing he said was philosophy. As a choral director, you've got to have one. And of course, I got really excited because that's the whole point of this show, is trying to help people come up with their concept of how they put together their philosophy of education, their why. In a lot of ways, it's our epistemology. Epistemology is just a fancy word for how you know stuff. So all of these elements go together to make our choral philosophy as conductors and as teachers. So to have Dr. Ely start his talk with the thing that is the most important is your philosophy. You've got to have one. You've got to be able to articulate it. If people ask you what your philosophy is, and I agree with this, you've got to be able to explain it to people, especially those that maybe are uninitiated. Another thing he said that I thought was really interesting was that everyone wants to do a good job. If they don't, they just don't know how. And this immediately made me think of a story. He shared a story about one of his most struggling students that he struggled to teach and to connect with. And so, of course, that made me reflect on one of my favorite stories about a student that I simply misunderstood, because I think that's a lot of times what happens is we see a student who is a thorn in our side all of the time, and we assume that that kid just wants to get in our way, that they want to disrupt the process. But I think Dr. Ely's insight that everyone wants to do good and do a good job is probably true. If we've got that student who's just insufferable, it's probably likely that at some level they wish they weren't that way. They wish they were the ideal student that gets lots of praise from the teacher, or that they're the best singer in the class, or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish with your kids. It's probably just that they don't know how. So I thought of the story of my first year. It was my first year teaching. So I'm 22, maybe 23 by that point in the school year. And I decided to take the high school chamber choir at a school that up until this point had had a fairly inactive program over the last several years. They didn't go on trips. They didn't take the choir really out in public at all for several years prior to the time I got there. And so I decided to put a trip on the schedule where we were going to get on a bus on a Saturday morning and take the choir to a chamber choir festival in front of other kids their age. A very big deal for them. They'd never done anything like this. And of course, you do what teachers do, which is to give the riot act to the kids the day before about how important it is to be on time to the bus, how important it is to be wearing your correct uniform, have your music and your water bottle and your pencil and all the things that you need for a festival, and be on time, because if you're not on time, the bus is going to leave. Okay, so of course, as a new teacher, just lots of testosterone at that age, right? I'm quite scary, and I'm saying all these things very sternly to the kids, and of course they're all nodding, and we're going to do it, Mr. Muntz. We're going to be there. Well, this choir, unlike a lot of the convention choirs we just heard, was not a very balanced ensemble. I think we had 3 basses, some guys who could kind of match pitch, maybe 4 tenors, and I don't know, 15 or 16 girls, I think. And one of my basses, one of my only guys who can sing low and actually sing the right notes, is late to the bus on that Saturday morning. They're supposed to pull out at 7:15, and I think it's like 7:20. He's still not there, and so of course I'm pacing up and down the aisle, telling all the kids, guys, he's late, he's letting us down, but we're gonna have to leave him. This is what I was talking about yesterday. We can't do this, but we're gonna have to leave him behind, and we'll do the best we can without him, given that speech. And so I tell the bus driver to go ahead and leave. And we're pulling out of the parking lot. And the parking lot is overlooking a hill down into a neighborhood of residential area next to the school. And as the bus is pulling out of the parking lot, I see what appears to be a student on a bicycle racing down the hill towards the school. And as it gets closer, it turns out that my prodigal bass is indeed on his bicycle racing down the hill towards the school. And so I instruct the bus driver to go and kind of drive towards him so that we can get to him quickly. We go and grab his bike. We put it on the bus with us. He gets on there, of course, out of breath. My first reaction is to just lay into him. I'm chewing him out, talking to him about letting the team down. We're going to be late now, and this is our first time in front of this group of clinicians and people, and we're representing the school, and all the things that you tell a kid when they've not met expectations. And he politely waited for me to finish, at which point and of course I'm fuming, but he waited for me to finish, and when I was done, he said, Mr. Muntz, I'm really sorry. I got here as fast as I could, but my mom didn't come home again last night. And so my little sister didn't have anybody to make breakfast, and she was scared, and I had to wait for my grandma to get here so that somebody could watch my sister before I left the house. And I was punched in the stomach in a moment that changed my life forever as a teacher. Because in college, you learn about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all the things that your students go through or potentially go through that might prevent them from being ideal students. Sorry, I'm getting emotional on my podcast here. you learn about that stuff in college, but you don't know it until you've seen the face of a kid who's in that situation. This was a kid who had an absent mother who frequently, I learned later, would not come home. He had a routine where he was the primary caregiver for his 7-year-old sister. And what I realized in that moment is, of all the bloviating that I had done before about how important this was, that to that kid in his life at that moment, choir was important, but it's not the most important thing. It wasn't the most important thing to him on that morning, and he still made it. He still did everything that he could do to make it. It changed my model in my mind of what makes an ideal student. So that was a long deviation from my stated topic, but I share that story only because when you hear a great professor and a great teacher like Dr. Ely talking about how he formulates his philosophy, that's the power of sharing your philosophy, is that it can cause, like it did in me, an immediate reflection on who I am now as a teacher and the stories that I have of why. So this would be another example, if you're listening and sticking with the episode all the way through, of an opportunity to jump on Choralosophers, which is our closed Facebook group, and share any stories that you have about moments where you had real experiences that shaped your why, shaped how you looked at your students, and shaped how you thought about them as your ability to determine their needs and to determine what they need from you in that moment. So with that student, obviously I changed my tune really quickly. I didn't lower my standards for what it was expected to happen, but I did figure out ways to develop a language in which I delivered those standards with more compassion, emphasizing communication rather than perfection. And I think that was an important step for me as a young teacher. And understanding what my students needed was just one of many things that I sucked at as a young teacher. See what I did there? That's called a segue. For those of you who are new to the radio announcer lingo, I segued into our topic of the day, which is the title of the episode, What I Suck At. So as I said early in my teaching career, there were lots and lots of things that I sucked at, and there are still things that I suck at. And the reason I chose to call the episode What I Suck At is because I like colorful language, but also because I think it's an important thing to point out from an introspection angle of how important it is to acknowledge and embrace and admit and discuss freely the things that you aren't good at. I think that's an important skill, and I think it matters. I mentioned this a little bit in the first episode when dealing with the concept of being happy and being happy with yourself, but I think it also plays into the idea of being able to grow and learn. You can't grow and learn if you're only interested in discussing the things that you're already good at. You're not going to knock things off your suck list, as you will hear my suck list in a little bit. You're not going to knock things off that list and put them on the not suck list unless you're willing to be open and honest about all of those things. So in the first episode, I talked about this pervasive Instagram version of our careers and our lives that seems to be so popular, which is that we'll only talk about our successes, and of course people only put up on Instagram the best versions of what they look like and all of these things, and I think that's fine. It has its place. I mean, there are reasons that it's a good idea to use your social media to share the best things about your life, and but at the same time, if that follows you into the rest of your life, into your quote real life, then that's where it becomes a problem. So I have put together my own suck list here, and I'm going to start with that just as a way to get your brain spinning about what your suck list might be. And then we're going to jump over to our Corolospher's Facebook group, and I've recorded there some answers from listeners who would like to share something that they're not very good at. I think the route to a healthy sense of growth in your own ability and your own self-esteem requires a little bit of yin and yang. In other words, it might be counterintuitive to say it this way, but you could actually help your self-esteem by talking more about what you suck at. Here's what I mean by that. The obvious answer would be no, you fluff up your ego by focusing on the things that you're good at and self-affirmation. You hear this a lot as the path to self-esteem. The problem is, though, I think that we fool ourselves by doing that, and we are smarter than that. When we are only self-affirming, even though we're talking to ourselves, we know we're lying to ourselves. We know that we're leaving out the other part of the picture. So if the goal is long-term growth and long-term self-esteem and long-term happiness, why not tell yourself the whole picture? Because I know on my suck list, there is a whole bunch of stuff that if it were 10 years ago, the things that were on my suck list then are now on my strength list because I worked on them. In order to work on them, you've got to acknowledge them. And so I'm going to share my lists with you, and then we're going to get to some lists shared by some of our listeners. So here's the first thing. Things I suck at. I am horribly messy and unorganized. People who work with me know that this is true. People who live with me also know that this is true. If it is another thing that I suck at, if it is not written into my calendar, I forget it. And even if it is written into my calendar, that is not a guarantee that I will remember it. I'm very scatterbrained. I'm the absent-minded professor, you might say. In the classroom, I am not good at sticking to a plan, so I don't even make one anymore. I tried early on, and I can't stick with it anyway, and so it oftentimes causes me more anguish to try to make a plan than it does to just wing it. Musically, I have a much better ear for pitch than I do for rhythm, so oftentimes I struggle to hear the trickier patterns in my head. This also causes me to avoid music that has that type of challenge in it. But because I'm aware of that, it causes different strategies than I might otherwise use if I was avoiding that truth about myself. So even with my high school kids, if there's a really tricky rhythm, oftentimes I'll look to my drummers. I've got lots of great drummers that play or that sing in the choir. And if there's a rhythm that I'm not working out correctly, I might just glance at them and go, what? And let them demonstrate it because it's not one of my strengths. I mean, I have above average music reading skills, I guess you could say, but if the rhythm gets too out there, I will probably melt down. Keyboard skills are not where I want them to be. I can get us through a rehearsal, but I don't play in public, and that's a big regret of mine, so I pretty much suck at the piano. I'm not good at reading people's body language and recognizing their emotional needs. I take people at the face value of their language, and I really have to concentrate in order to tell if someone's words are in conflict with what their body language, their emotional tone is conveying. And some people have a natural ability to do that. I do not. And I am also not a good listener. As you could possibly imagine, of someone who decided to host a podcast and talk for an hour, listening is not one of my most natural skills. I'm working on it, and I'm way better than I used to be. But if you're sitting down and having a conversation with me for any length of time, and you've spoken for any length of time, you might want to high-five me because that means that I was really trying. Like I was really trying to not interrupt, to not try to think about the next thing I want to say. And I know lots of people struggle with this, but I feel like I suck at it, and so I'm trying to be better. But there's also things that I'm good at. Many of these things like I said before, were in my suck list 10 years ago. But now that I've acknowledged them and tried to work on them, I'm becoming better at them. So there's the yin to my yang is my skill list. I'm a great multitasker. It's just how my brain works. It's easy and natural to me, like swimming for a fish is to have lots of tasks going on all at once, to keep details in my head that are task related, even if one of the details is related to one task and then I hear another detail related to another task, I can roll with that. I don't have to write it down. I just keep it straight. So that's a skill that I am fortunate to have, in the sense that I know not everyone's that way, but we're all different. Another skill is, and this is going to seem like a weirdly phrased skill, but I care a lot about everything I do. One of the things that people say about me if they know me in person is that I'm extremely intense, and that meaning that there is nothing I do that I don't find profoundly important. And I will kind of expect other people around me to find it profoundly important too, or else we have struggles. I'm also good at explaining things in a new way to people, in a way that they haven't heard it phrased before. Maybe they haven't heard the line of reasoning of how I explain it before. And so opening up people's brains to thinking stuff that they've never thought, that's a skill. I have a strong ability to demonstrate for students vocally. I can think on my feet, and I'm addicted to learning, which serves well as a teacher. I always look out for the newest and most interesting vocal pedagogy, the early music scholarship and language skills. I love studying linguistics and love studying economics, obviously philosophy, all those types of things, which gives me constantly something to say in the classroom, something to point to, some connection to try to make. So the reason I share both lists with you is not to have an opportunity to brag about the things that I am good at, but simply to demonstrate that it's a balance. Not a single one of us, and I don't care if you are the most talented musician and educator in the entire world, you all have a suck list. Everybody's got one. And I think that even if you are highly talented and highly gifted, you can still get better. And one of the ways we do that is by acknowledging the things that we are struggling with so that we have some area in which to grow. If we only focus on the things that we're good at, then we start to atrophy, in my opinion. So next, I'm going to go to the Choralosaphers Facebook page, and I'm going to shout out some listeners on there who decided to become vulnerable and in public share some of their strengths and weaknesses. Mailbag. I've always wanted to say that on a show. I probably won't do it again. I promise I won't do it again. But in future episodes, we will be responding to some listener mail, whether it comes in the form of comments on the Choralosaphers Facebook page, maybe public comments on the Choralosophy Podcast Facebook group, or on Choralosophy on Twitter. You can also email in your comments, questions, or simply responses to anything I claim or share on the show to choralosophy@gmail.com. I want that conversation. I would love to continue to respond and share what you all are thinking in some type of forum on the show. So I asked on the Choralosaphers Facebook page specifically on this topic, which is for people to share a strength and a weakness. And I did require that anyone commenting shared both. And it was funny, in a couple different instances, people get on and the natural instinct is to share the weakness because we tend to have a bias towards one or the other. To share our strengths is bragging. To share our weaknesses is showing some type of healthy humility. And as in several episodes so far that you've already heard, I'm going to claim that neither of those is correct, which is kind of how I look at most of the things in the world, which is to be a little bit of a contrarian. I think the healthiest and best way to approach things like this is to share one of both. So I made that a rule on the post. And so from each of these folks, I've got one of both. So for listeners and posters, if I pronounce your name incorrectly, please correct me for future episodes if I mention your name again. The first one, I know I won't mess up. Dustin McKinney is a local Kansas City friend, choral director here, a little bit north of the city, and he jumped on the thread and shared a strength and a weakness. Dustin says his weakness is keeping all of the plates spinning. We've all been there. Multiple ensembles with different special performances, fundraising, bus forms, grades, purchase orders, booster meetings, informative emails, class announcements, and having a personal life. The hardest part is to remember to be healthy and spend time with loved ones when there is so much demanding of time. Preach, Dustin, preach. So, strength from Dustin McKinney. I always know what needs to happen next. All of the above is hard to juggle, but I have been able to keep track of it. My program is growing, my students are developing, and the successes that can be measured year to year. So that's an awesome example, actually, of what I was talking about before. So Dustin feels that, at least what it seems like here, is that he has a bunch of things that he struggles with, and that by acknowledging them, he is able to stay on top of it. And I think that if he were to be in denial of those struggles, then maybe he wouldn't be having the success that he's having. So way to go, Dustin. Next, from Jaron Jorgensen. Jaron says that one of his weaknesses is that he is not a natural motivator. So if his students aren't feeling it in a rehearsal, then he is not very good at finding ways of lighting a fire under them and inspiring them to do the work. That's interesting. The idea that a person feels that they're not a natural motivator. That would be a challenge for sure if you're working with young people in particular. And I'm not sure exactly what level Jaron teaches. I don't know him personally, but that's a really good insight about a person, introspection, if you will. He says that his strength is, I am a vocalist first and conductor second, so every decision I make in regards to my ensemble's sound is approached from the perspective of a singer. I am able to pull healthy, rich, warm-blooded sounds out of my ensembles, and students love singing for me as a result. And then he says, blend, comma, not bland, exclamation point, which I take that to be an ism, maybe. We'll call it a Jaronism. Blend, not bland. I love it. So that's a very good insight as well. Next, from Caleb Sinclair. Caleb's weakness, he says, is allowing myself to be risky in rehearsal, conducting in a more macro pattern. These are examples that he gives. Conducting in a more macro pattern, maybe, rehearsing a cappella, talking less, all in surrendering control. So he feels like that's something that is a struggle. I will tell you, by the way, Caleb, rehearse a cappella. Start tomorrow. Don't play notes for your kids. And if you do the work on Sight Reading Factory that I forced myself to do years ago and rip off that keyboard Band-Aid, you will feel like you are in control. A control freak's dream is to get rid of that piano. So that's just a little bit of a soapbox. Okay, Caleb lists as a strength incorporating larger musical concepts into rehearsal processes for individual pieces. I'd be interested to know more about what you mean, Caleb, there, incorporating a larger musical concepts into the rehearsal. I think what you're probably referring to is having some kind of almost unit focus within rehearsing a piece. Like, what is it that we're trying to pull out of this piece for the students to learn? That's a really good skill. And not all teachers have that. That's something I would love to work more on. Next, from Zachary Singer. Zachary says that a strength is finding out how to bring out the underlying meaning of textual and musical lines and diagnosing technical problems. That's great. A weakness, failing to remember how fragile the student ego truly is. I'm bad about setting my standards at a high but attainable level. Interesting. So it sounds like an adjustment or a journey to find a natural state of expectations versus reality. Okay, moving on to Matt Walker. Matt Walker says his weakness is definitely piano skills. I feel you there, Matt. Although I've gotten a lot better over the years, I wish I was more proficient at the keyboard. A strength for Matt Walker is my undergraduate and graduate work was as a vocalist, so I feel confident in teaching my singers the how of singing. As fewer of my students are studying privately, I am so thankful for my previous opportunities to study voice. That is a very important skill, Matt, as we are, as choral directors, oftentimes the only voice teacher our students will ever have. Next, Maurice Burgess says, I'm not your typical artsy type. On one level, my pedagogy is fantastic and extremely obsessively well studied. I take being a practice professional seriously and try to instill this into my kids. I have had to work hard in order to be organized. That's a weakness. So is reminding myself that not every child wants to do the thing for a living and that their experience needs to be just as valuable and rewarding for their goals within the program as those most ambitious students. And Maurice, that's a great point. A very tiny percentage, even in a big, thriving metropolitan type program at the high school or middle school level, still a very small percentage of those kids are going to go into music for a career. And if we're only teaching to those ones, we lose our job and our profession real quick because that just cuts down the numbers. And so, Maurice, that's a really good insight because we've got to teach to the whole class. I agree. Melinda Lamb says that she feels that a weakness is delegating tasks or asking for help. She says, then when I do, I feel guilty. Don't feel guilty, Melinda. Ask for help. And the paperwork. Oh, that was my interpretation of what UGH should sound like, just so you know. She says that a strength is putting their students and their humanity first. That is excellent as well. Drew Albert says he has a weakness, which is teaching music in a foreign language like French, German, or Spanish, and he feels very self-conscious about IPA abilities, as it has been a while since my last singer's diction class. And then he says that his strength is programming. I've really been successful in selecting repertoire that allows my students to develop their technique while also being pieces they can connect to. Then the thread goes on to talk a little bit about, Michael McGlynn jumped on there, and of course, Michael does a lot of stuff with the Irish language, and he made a really good point about IPA not being all that helpful in some types of languages, and which I agree. Still got to use it, though. Choir teachers, go out there and really nail down your IPA skills. That's really important. Got a couple more here. Graham Leonard says that his weaknesses are piano skills. I didn't have any piano skills before college and basically just practiced a ton for class piano. After class piano was over, I didn't keep up with it and my skills got worse. So that seems to be a popular one so far, including on my suck list. Graham's strengths, he says, are music literacy. I'm a huge proponent of solfege and takadimi. I feel like I'm excellent at building up the student skills so that they can become independent musicians. Part of this process is a cappella rehearsals, which we do every single day. Way to go, Graham. It makes the students accountable for their work. But on the other hand, I get to practice my weak piano skills. Keep it up, Graham. Finally, Sarah McLean says that her weaknesses is differentiation. Ooh, good education buzzword there. Her weakness is differentiation. She says, I have students from one extreme of music reading ability to the other, and everyone in between, making sure the weaker kids understand what's going on and the stronger ones don't get bored. And the same, she says, in her adult choir. Her strength, she says, I have a good ear and pick up music really quickly, so I can help out with parts without much study, etc. Now that last one is a really good point too. All of us will develop our ear and our ability to audiate and hear the music in our head. We'll get better and better at that over the course of our career, which for you young directors means less taking the music home and more being balanced and spending time with your family and not having to take your work home. So really work to develop that skill. That's been something that's been huge for me in my ability to leave everything at school at 3 o'clock when I leave. So thank you all so much for those contributions. And if you are still listening to the episode at this point, that means hopefully you've got some food for thought and you've got something that you enjoyed out of this episode. So I encourage you to share the episode, like it, subscribe to iTunes or to the Google Play channel for this podcast, as well as follow us on Twitter, Facebook, join Coralosophers. There's all kinds of ways for you to be involved in the conversation and to be notified the next time an episode comes out. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time on the Coralosophy Podcast.